January 7, 2007. San Diego, California. Antonio Cromartie picks off a pass, plants his foot at the 5-yard line, and runs 109 yards untouched for a touchdown, the longest interception return in NFL history at the time. The stadium noise does not quite capture what the replay confirms. This is something the sport had never produced before. Pro Bowl, 4 times eventually, 38 career interceptions. A defensive resume that belongs in any serious conversation about cornerbacks of his generation. Summer 2010. New York Jets, training facility, Florham Park, New Jersey. That same player cannot begin the NFL season without risk of arrest. His employer, the New York Jets organization, writes a check for $500,000, not to Antonio Cromartie, on his behalf, to satisfy unpaid child support obligations spread across multiple states, to keep him out of a county holding cell before Week 1 kicks off. On the surface, the most publicly embarrassing athlete story of the decade. But the Jets did not save Antonio Cromartie. They protected their investment. There is a difference. Nobody had ever explained that difference to him. Tallahassee, Florida, 1984. State capital. College town anchored by Florida State University. Not the most desperate geography in the American South, but not one with surplus exits either. The timber economy had thinned. The manufacturing base that employed a generation was not what it had been. For a black kid growing up in that city in the late 80s and early 90s, in a household held together entirely by his mother, in a neighborhood where the available models of success were few and the available models of failure were everywhere. The doors that mattered were the ones football opened. That was not a cliché, it was a structural reality. Jermaine Cromartie was in prison for much of Antonio's childhood. Not absent in the complicated, softened sense that these stories tend to settle into when the details become uncomfortable. Not working long hours or living in another city. Incarcerated. Gone in the most legally definitive way a father can be gone from his child's formative years. The table had a chair. It was empty because the state was using it for something else. This left Antonio with something specific, and it is worth being precise about what it was. He knew with absolute clarity what he did not want to become. Not Jermaine. He said this in interviews. He made the commitment early and held it through circumstances that repeated in different forms the original test. He was going to be present. He was going to show up. He was not going to do what was done to him. What he did not have, because there was genuinely no one available to provide it, was a working model of what present fatherhood actually required. Not in the emotional sense where his instincts were clear. In the practical, logistical, legal sense. How do you financially support children across multiple states under different court orders, with different payment calculation formulas and different deadlines? What happens when one jurisdiction issues a contempt finding while you are on a team flight to Dallas? How do you keep 8 separate sets of legal obligations synchronized with an NFL payroll calendar that runs on its own schedule, indifferent to what family courts in Florida or Georgia or California are expecting to receive, and when nobody teaches that class? Not in Tallahassee. Not at Florida State, where Cromartie developed into one of the elite cornerback prospects in the country under a coaching staff that was excellent at developing defensive backs and had no particular responsibility for preparing them for the legal architecture of the lives they were already living outside the facility. The NFLPA's financial education offerings were generic. Budgeting principles, investment basics. They were built for the median player's situation. Antonio Cromartie's situation was not median. In 2006, the San Diego Chargers selected him with the 19th overall pick. Before he signed his rookie contract, his family obligations were already more complex than anything the Chargers' standard onboarding process was designed to address. His pre-draft background check documented it. His scouting profile noted it. The organization chose to evaluate it as a personal matter rather than a financial infrastructure problem requiring specialized support. Nobody sat across from him with a family lawyer and a real number. There was a signing table, a jersey, a photograph. He had made the commitment to be present for all of his children. The system he was entering had no infrastructure to help him keep it. He would spend the next 4 years finding this out, one missed payment at a time. San Diego, 2006 through 2009. His first NFL start, his first interception, the beginning of a career that would eventually produce 4 Pro Bowl selections, a body of work that placed him among the most effective cornerbacks of his era. Then, January 7th. The record, 109 yards. The ball in his hands at the 2-yard line, every receiver and blocker on the field, between him and the end zone and the next 30 seconds, producing something that would be replayed in NFL Films packages for the next decade. The longest interception return in league history at the time. Not a close second. A record. The kind of individual achievement that attaches to a player's name permanently, that shows up first in any profile that confirms what all the pre-draft evaluation suggested, the talent was real. Every defensive coordinator in the league updated their evaluation. Every general manager noted the confirmation. The contract numbers require context. What NFL cornerback salaries looked like on paper in the mid-2000s and what they actually produced in a player's bank account were 2 different figures separated by a calculation. Most players were not fully prepared to do. Non-guaranteed money. The majority of most stated contract values could disappear if a player was cut or injured before the payment vested. California state income tax, running at among the highest rates in the country, took its share. Federal tax took its share. Agent commission. Jock taxes filed across 8 to 10 different states per season, each requiring a return, each with its own rate applied to income earned inside that state on game day. What arrived in his account in any given year was measurably smaller than the headline contract figure. Against that actual number, child support obligations running at an estimated $336,000 per year. $28,000 per month. Court-ordered. Legally enforced. Mathematically unforgiving. That is not irresponsibility. That is a margin that does not allow for error. But here is what the Pro Bowl invitations and the highlight packages were not built to show. Child support in the United States is administered at the state level. Each of Cromartie's payment obligations, each child, each mother, each court order existed inside a different legal ecosystem. Different calculation formulas, different payment schedules, different enforcement offices operating on different timelines, different standards for what constitutes a missed payment serious enough to trigger contempt proceedings. NFL game schedules do not account for county court filing deadlines. Away games remove players from their primary state for 3 to 4 days at a time. County clerk offices are closed on game days. A payment sent late, not refused, not deliberately withheld, sent late because the payroll cycle and the deadline cycle did not align, can trigger a contempt finding. A contempt finding can produce a warrant. A warrant does not check the NFL schedule before it activates. Correctly navigating all 8 of these parallel systems requires lawyers in multiple jurisdictions retained and available billing by the hour reachable across time zones on Tuesday afternoons when the court in one state is filing paperwork while the team is watching film in another. That infrastructure existed. It was available. Antonio Cromartie had not assembled it. No one in the NFL system identified his situation as one requiring it. Derek Jeter maintained an army of advisors to handle the complexity of his financial and personal life. Tom Brady's management infrastructure was sophisticated enough to navigate business relationships across multiple countries. The resources required to manage Cromartie's obligations were by comparison modest. Nobody helped him identify the need. In 2010, the Chargers traded him to the Jets. The transaction moved his contract and his obligations. It also opened a gap in the legal coordination during the transition period when accumulated arrears across multiple states reached a level that triggered active warrants. Real legal exposure. Potential arrest before a single preseason snap. The Jets needed a starting cornerback. They could not afford to have their starting cornerback in a holding cell on the way to practice. $500,000 advanced against his salary. Crisis resolved. Season begins. HBO arrived shortly after, with cameras for Hard Knocks produced by NFL Films. A producer during training camp asked him to name his children on camera. He was in the environment where jobs are decided, and every exchange carries evaluation weight. He listed the names, lost, the thread corrected, himself stumbled. The footage aired in August 2010. 4 Pro Bowls did not produce a viral moment. 30 seconds at a training facility did. This is not a bankruptcy story. Antonio Cromartie did not lose everything in the way that word usually means in NFL financial narratives. He did not gamble. He did not invest in a fraudulent scheme. There is no single catastrophic decision that can be pointed to as the pivot. What he had was a cash flow crisis, a timing mismatch between when income arrived and when legal obligations required it to arrive somewhere specific in a specific account in a specific state, processed by a specific office whose internal deadline did not align with the NFL's payroll calendar. The coverage almost never made this distinction. Broke and cash flow constrained are different conditions with different causes and structurally different solutions. One requires more money. The other requires better infrastructure. The cause here was a system with 8 moving parts across 8 jurisdictions that had never been mapped, coordinated, or managed with tools appropriate to the situation. Not because he refused help, because the help specific to this situation was never offered. Failure number 1. The NFL's financial education was not built for his situation. When San Diego signed Antonio Cromartie in 2006, his legal and financial configuration was more complex than the team's standard rookie orientation was designed to address. Generic budgeting workshops, general investment advice, information about the NFLPA's certified advisor list, a one-size framework for a situation that required a bespoke one. The Chargers' pre-draft background process documented his family situation. The information existed inside the organization before he walked in the door. Nobody treated it as a financial infrastructure problem. Nobody assigned a family law specialist to sit with him in the first week of camp and map the jurisdictional architecture of his obligations before it became unmanageable. They evaluated him as a first-round defensive talent. They provided first-round defensive talent onboarding. The gap between those two things cost him and the organizations that followed measurable documented money and one arrest risk before a season opener. They scouted him for 4 years. Nobody spent 4 hours on multi-state family law. Failure number 2. 8 jurisdictions, 0 coordination. Child support enforcement in the United States operates at the state level. Each of Cromartie's obligations lived inside a separate legal ecosystem. Its own formula for calculating payment amounts, its own schedule, its own enforcement office, its own standard for what triggers contempt proceedings. Getting 8 of those systems synchronized with a professional athlete's income schedule, which itself varies by week, involves regular travel across multiple taxing jurisdictions and produces income on NFL timetables that bear no relationship to family court calendars is a specialized legal task. It requires retained counsel in multiple states actively monitoring filing deadlines and someone whose specific job is ensuring the timing works across all 8 systems simultaneously. That kind of coordination is available. Wealthy individuals with complex financial and family situations use it routinely. It requires identifying the need and committing resources to address it. No one in the NFL system identified the need. No one committed resources. His visibility made him a priority target for enforcement offices that deployed fewer resources pursuing the majority of delinquent payers. High-profile documented income, traceable assets. A professional athlete is the most efficient possible use of a contempt filing. Fame did not protect him from enforcement. It made him the most attractive enforcement target in the room. Failure number 3. The advance fixed one deadline. The Jets' $500,000 advance resolved the immediate crisis. It did not resolve the situation that produced it. The advance was not a gift. Cromartie repaid it from his own future salary, effectively borrowing against himself, with the Jets holding the accounting. And the advance did nothing to restructure the underlying payment schedules, retain legal counsel in the affected states, create a monitoring system to catch the next deadline before it became a warrant or address the fundamental mismatch between his income calendar and his obligation calendars. One deadline resolved, the structure unchanged. The next deadline would arrive on its own schedule. It always does. The Jets fixed the problem. They had a starting cornerback unavailable for Week 1. The problem Antonio Cromartie had continued past the check clearing. Failure number 4. Hard Knocks captured 30 seconds. HBO's Hard Knocks is produced by NFL Films, a subsidiary of the National Football League. The NFL benefits directly from the content the series generates in subscription value in advertising, in the cultural relevance that comes from being on premium television during training camp. Every player in Jets camp that summer signed consent forms permitting filming. The forms did not include provisions allowing players to review how footage would be framed or edited, what narrative context would be constructed around it, or what the long-term reputational consequences of specific editorial choices might be for the person on camera. A producer asked him to name his children. He was in the middle of training camp, the environment where roster decisions are being made in real time, where every interaction with a coach carries evaluation weight, where the psychological load is not small. He listed names. He lost count. He corrected himself. He stumbled. The clip aired. It spread across every platform. For millions of people who had never watched Antonio Cromartie play defense, who had never seen the 109-yard return, never tracked his coverage grades, never looked up his 4 Pro Bowl selections, the 30-second clip became the complete picture. NFL Films benefited from the content. HBO benefited from the ratings. Antonio Cromartie received the label. No portion of the revenue generated by that specific piece of content went to the person whose vulnerability produced it. The actual low point is not the warrant or the advance or the clip. It is the moment the footage had aired and he understood there was nothing he could do to surround it with context. No right of response in the consent form. No mechanism to say publicly what was happening in his life that week, the obligations he was managing, the commitment he was holding. None of that was content. None of it was what the cameras were there to capture. He knew his children. He had committed to every one of them. The commitment, the one he made specifically because Jermaine had not made it for him, did not generate footage worth 30 seconds of airtime. The stumble did. So what is the dark reality of Antonio Cromartie's story? It is not that he was irresponsible. Irresponsibility requires a person who had the appropriate tools and chose not to use them. The appropriate tools were never assembled. The NFL placed him inside a financial and legal situation of documented complexity and provided an orientation process built for a different situation. It is not that he does not care about his children. Everything visible over 15 years, the commitment to remain present, the marriages and the family, the public statements in countless interviews, points in exactly the opposite direction. And it is not that the Jets rescued him. They advanced $500,000 against his own future salary to protect their roster. He was not rescued. He was managed. The money he owed, he still owed, just to a different creditor. Here is the truth. Antonio Cromartie grew up in a household shaped by his father's absence. He had no working model for what present fatherhood required, not emotionally where his instincts were clear, but logistically and legally where the infrastructure was everything. He entered the NFL with obligations the league was not equipped to help him manage. When the crisis arrived and given the structure it was always going to arrive, the system produced a bank transfer and a camera crew in that order. He navigated it anyway, imperfectly, publicly, expensively. But he navigated it. And then he continued doing the thing that the cameras were never positioned to record. The Hard Knocks clip is 30 seconds long. It has been shared and reshared across platforms for 15 years. It shows him under training camp pressure, stumbling through a list of names that belong to children he has spent 2 decades showing up for. Jermaine Cromartie was not at many of the moments that mattered in Antonio's life. Not at the games. Not at the graduations the games were supposed to make possible. Not at the table. Antonio Cromartie has been at all of those moments for 14 children. Not perfectly. Not without the financial strain that the system never adequately addressed, but present. Which is the one thing that was not modeled for him. The one thing he had to build from nothing. The one thing no camera in Florham Park that summer thought to document. 30 seconds of stumbling. 20 years of showing up. The camera recorded one of them. This story matters, not as a lesson about personal choices, which is how the coverage framed it. Not as a cautionary tale about family formation, which is how the commentary framed it, but as documentation of what the NFL is actually doing when it identifies a complex situation in a background check, hands the player a generic financial brochure, and waits for the crisis. The system knew. The scouting report knew. The Jets' payroll department knew enough to write a $500,000 check within weeks of the trade. The question is not why Antonio Cromartie ended up in that situation. The question is why everything the NFL knew did not produce anything more useful than a retroactive advance and a consent form that allowed his struggle to become premium cable content. Antonio Cromartie is 41 years old. He is still married to Terrika. All 14 children remain in his life. Reality television created income after football ended, not glamorous but stable. He appears on media, speaks about athletes and mental health and what the system takes without replacing. His father was not at many of the things that mattered. He has been at all of them. No headline was written about that. The headline that was written runs 30 seconds and ends with him losing count. The camera was pointed in the wrong direction the whole time.